Collier. I am a master's student here at Oxford. I am with St. Catherine's College, also known as St. Pat's. I'm doing early modern English literature, obviously quite different, but I have a very special kind of interest in philosophy. And yeah, and basically, oh, hang on, let me just move my mouse. Um, so today we're talking about a very important part of philosophy. It kind of is like quite literally the building blocks of it. It's called epistemology, which literally means the study of knowledge. Epistem is Greek for um, basically knowledge. Obviously, Sophie Pravahi mentioned philosophy means the love of knowledge. Philo means love. Sophie means knowledge or wisdom. Epistem also means wisdom. Um, so epistemology is all about kind of understanding or trying to figure out how we know what we know, right? So um, our mission today is going to be to try and give you an overview of the study of all the kind of major voices throughout history, of the things that people have said and argued with each other, because half of philosophy, if not all of it, is just arguing with each other, because no one can agree on anything. Um, we'll be going from the ancient Greeks all the way to the 21st century. And while we're doing so, we'll be trying to answer this question of why do I care? Um, what is the point in looking at something like philosophy, especially something like epistemology? Um, I'm going to try and show you in this time that when we ask these questions, there are always massive ramifications in how we decide to answer, as it can directly affect the way we act towards other people and the world around us. Now, with such a big topic and such a confusing nature, I'm very much kind of expecting that this presentation will probably leave more questions than answers. Um, and it's actually kind of the mission, because epistemology is all about kind of um, asking questions that demand more questions. We're always in pursuit of this idea of absolute truth. Um, and what we might notice as our questions develop and get more nuanced is that for us to ask those new questions in the first place, we will have learned something new, even if we haven't completely solved it and we have no questions left. We're still in a better position than we were an hour ago. So that's the mission today. I think we can probably skip a few slides ahead. Thank you so much for getting this presentation up. Would we at all be able to get to slide 4 with the ancient Greeks? Amazing. Thank you so much. So, um, I suppose before I properly get into this, I do also want to say we're going to be using a lot of crazy words that maybe you'll already know, like the word knowledge, as well as words that you will have probably never come across, such as a priori, a posteriori, ontological, and I'm going to try and explain them as I go. But again, as I said, you might have more questions than answers, but we'll hope that we've learned a bit more. So we're starting off today with the ancient Greeks, Socrates, who is my personal favorite. He's often considered a key founder in the history of philosophy, to the point that philosophers before him are literally called the pre-Socratic philosophers. I mean, imagine being a guy who is like an epochal moment that everybody before you is called before you. That's what Socrates was. And funnily enough, he never wrote anything down. Everything that we know about Socrates came from his main student, Plato. Um, he kind of wrote everything, Plato wrote everything mentioning Socrates. So there's a bit of difficulty knowing what is stuff that Plato wanted to say and what Socrates actually said. The main things that we do know is that Socrates loved to be on the street and he loved to ask people questions. He would ask people, why do we love? And they'd be like, I don't know, because it makes me feel good. And they'd be like, why? And he kind of would keep doing this thing a bit like a toddler, that why game, because he kind of was doing the same thing that I'm trying to do, of constantly asking this question to try and get to some fundamental truth. But there was always an extra question to pull it back. Eventually, everybody in Athens hated him for doing this. So they took him to court. They told him to be quiet, and he said no. One of the most famous things that he ever said while he was on court, on trial, was that he believed that he was smarter than everybody in the room because nobody in the room knew anything, including him. He knew fundamentally that there is no way to know anything, but he was smarter than everybody because he knew one thing, and that was that I know nothing. And that's that quote that I left at the bottom there. This painting here, I wouldn't be able to say who it is, but it's a very famous painting of the death of Socrates, because after he said this, they got even more angry at him and they put him to death. And he chose to drink poison hemlock, essentially dying for what he believed in. I think we can go on to the next slide. Thank you. So Socrates died never having written anything of his own. From what we can tell in Plato's writing, he never really came to any firm conclusions. In a way, this lack of answers and constant questions founded its own school of thought, which we call skepticism. Instead, his student Plato eventually Plato's own student Aristotle, you may have heard of those two guys, did come up with their own ideas of knowledge. So Plato believed in the value of what we call inherent intuition. He believed in this idea of forms, and for us to truly learn something, we have to think inward. We have to cast off the physical world. Sounds a bit strange, but let me try and explain. He believed that forms. He believed that, like a table, for example, is fundamentally always not going to be the true table. You have an idea of table when I say the word table, but a real table, maybe the one that you're sat on right now, has flaws in it. I know the one that I'm sat on has a little dent in there. I know my perfect table in my head doesn't have that. Maybe it's got a wobbly leg. Plato believed in this idea of true forms, the Platonic ideal, which is this higher land. And he believed that that is where true knowledge lies. And to get to it, we have to think inward and not outward. Aristotle, complete opposite. He believed that the only knowledge that we could truly know is stuff that we could see or perceive more broadly, things that we could measure. To some extent, he's sometimes called the first scientist because he laid the groundworks for what we consider the scientific method, making a claim, testing it, seeing how it responds, and making a new claim from that new knowledge of what we sense, of what we see. So these were the two kind of opposed views. Plato thinking more inward and higher, not thinking physically about the world, and Aristotle thinking more physically about the things you could see and perceive. These were the two ideas about how we could come to knowledge: reason and observation. I think we can go to the next slide here. So now we come to a very important moment of application here, because, of course, I'm sure what I've just spoken about is very confusing, but it has massive ramifications. Because Plato believed that knowledge came inherently from our minds, he believed that women had the same capacity for that, we have the same mind, right? Therefore, they should be, and he proposed this in his book Republic, in book 4 and 5, that women should be allowed, should be permitted the opportunity to be in positions of power. Because they have the same mind as us, they have the same capacity to lead, the same capacity to think, which obviously, hopefully, everybody agrees with in this room because it's true. Aristotle did not believe that. So Aristotle, because he relied on things like observations and the way the world was, he saw the traditional kind of gender roles that women were already in, and he saw them as the way they should be, which was fundamentally wrong. Right? He said this quite famous quote that he believed women were misbegotten males. Unfortunately, his belief was the one that pervaded for much of human history without much thought. So you can see this is a very important example of the way we try to even think about knowledge in the first place can have massive ramifications about the way we treat people and how we function in society. Then we can move on. So we've kind of already gotten to a bit of a dichotomy. We've got Plato over here who believes in the mind, something inherent, that he wants to think of something higher than the world, right? He thinks that truth is something that it cannot break. Aristotle is more in relation to the world, that true knowledge, as far as we're concerned, is all about the world, because the world is all we have. Everything that we see is all that matters, and therefore is the only knowledge that is worth it. So here we have two kind of splits in how we understand knowledge. We have, and this kind of ties into the claims, to the statements that I'm hoping that everybody looked at before this. So I might just get them up now if I can. But I remember it was stuff like a triangle has three sides. Red is a brighter color than yellow. Red is a better color than yellow. Red is a different color than yellow. I'm hoping when you went through all of these, you'll notice that some of them you might have agreed with, personally. Some of them you might have agreed with because, well, yeah, a triangle has three sides. That's what a triangle is. So this is what I'm trying to make the distinction with in a priori and a posteriori knowledge. You'll notice in the slide here, I've kind of underlined the way that you can remember the differences between what they mean. A priori is a kind of knowledge where what it is can be known before you even think about it, prior to even thinking about it. So a triangle, by definition, has three sides. The moment it has a fourth, it is no longer a triangle, it is a square or a rhombus. All bachelors are unmarried. The definition of a bachelor is an unmarried man. 2 + 2 = 4. There is no world where 2 + 2 can be anything other than 4, right? This is a priori knowledge. A posteriori is the opposite. It's where we learn something only through observation, a bit like what Aristotle was on about. This is something like me saying, I am a student at Oxford. You couldn't see me randomly and just assume I was a student at Oxford, because that's not inherent to the definition of me. That's something that must be learned through observation. So these are the two kind of forms of knowledge, a priori and a posteriori, and they become the kind of building blocks for many kind of philosophers in how they try to argue for certain beliefs. And I think if we move on to the next few slides, we'll see a particular kind of application of that. I forgot about this one. So this is another lovely story that I love from the ancient Greeks. So Plato really wanted to get to some kind of fundamental truth, right? And in doing this, he tried to go for an easy one. What is man, right? How do you describe man? And his best bet was featherless biped, which just means featherless thing that walks on 2 feet. The reason he said this is because he didn't really have monkeys. So the only other animal that existed that walked on 2 feet, apart from humans, was birds. So the only difference is that they have feathers, therefore a man is a featherless biped. And this obviously is completely false, completely absurd. And a funny little guy called Diogenes of Sinope, a hermit and a cynic and a skeptic, who lived on the street and a bit like Socrates, to be fair, but maybe a bit more extreme, um, waltzed into Plato's academy with a chicken where he had plucked all the feathers off it and went, "Behold, a man," and just let the chicken loose. So you can see already that we have a bit of an issue with trying to claim a priori truth. It's very difficult, and we'll kind of notice as this presentation goes on that it's an issue that keeps coming up. So in the next slide, we're now kind of skipping ahead. We're going over quite a few years. We're going to keep doing that. But I'm going to the medieval period. This is a quick kind of touching point that the medieval period is sometimes called a dark age. And what I want to show in these next few slides is that it wasn't, that it was actually a great moment of philosophical thought and a great application of some of these epistemological thoughts that were being talked about in the ancient in the times of the ancient Greeks, and especially there was a new aspect of knowledge that was brought up in the Islamic Golden Age that I'm very excited to kind of bring up with you later on. So our first kind of application of this in the next slide here, we have St. Aquinas. So one of the big questions of epistemology at this time was trying to prove that God existed. And for Aquinas, he went about an a posteriori route. His idea was trying to make some basic claims that we could all pretty much agree on, and from them come to some kind of idea that we all have to pretty much agree on. He didn't call them proofs, he called them arguments, because we can't necessarily all agree on some of the things, but they're pretty strong arguments. So, for example, one of his main, he made 5 main arguments. We're just going to talk about 2 here. So on the left here, you have the unmoved mover. We start off with that some things are in motion, right? I am currently waddling about. Maybe you're shifting about in your seat. Something had to move you. Maybe it was your inherent motion. Maybe it was something outside, or even the trees rustling in the wind had to move them, right? But then something had to move the wind, right? I'm no geologist, but I'm pretty sure stuff like crashes in the Arctic, moving great glacial periods, it crashes this wind across the sea. The sea makes the wind. What moves the sea? The moon moves the sea. What moves the moon? We kind of have this game of keep going back. Aquinas saw that this couldn't go back infinitely. Therefore, there must be something at the start. And for him, that must be God. This is an a posteriori form of argument, that we have all these kind of claims that we can pretty much observe and agree on. And we kind of come to a conclusion where we're like, yeah, that makes sense. You can kind of have the same thing in the next one, the first cause, which is a lot easier to explain. You have parents, your parents have parents, your parents' parents have parents. Does that go back infinitely? Does that go back to evolution? Does it go back to the first living thing on planet Earth? Does it go back to the asteroid that it rode back on 2.5 billion years ago? Does it go back even further to before the universe was created? We have a chain back, and surely there is a point where that stops, is what Aquinas believes. And Aquinas believes that that moment that originally started it must be God. These are his kind of main arguments. Again, it's an a posteriori argument for God of truths that we pretty much agree on, coming to a conclusion we can pretty much agree on. That is quite different from the next person we're going to talk about, who is Anselm. Um, so Anselm went for an ontological argument. Now, ontological arguments are all about trying to understand the essence of something. So ontology means like being. So it's essentially what we're talking about with a priori, that by definition, ontologically, a triangle has three sides because that's what a triangle is, right? Anselm tried to make the same kind of logic, but with God. He tried to define what God was. For him, God was a being that which no greater can be conceived. And if there is a being that which no greater could be conceived, then he contains all forms of perfection. And for him, it is more perfect for such a perfect thing to exist in reality than for it to only exist in the mind. If one can think of the most perfect thing and then it only exists in the mind, well, it would be more perfect for it to be real, therefore it must be real, is his argument. Hopefully, in me saying that, you already kind of see how that doesn't make a lot of sense. And that's exactly what Galileo said, our next guy. So Galileo lived about the same time as Anselm. He was living in France at the time. Anselm was Italian. And he thought he was preposterous. He was very much more in favor of Aristotle, where he needed to see things or observe things in some way, experience them to really know that something was true. And for him, saying that the definition of God means that he must be true doesn't really ring true. And the way he tried to disprove this was the idea of the perfect island. You could apply the exact same definition to an island. You could say, the perfect island is that which no greater island can be conceived, and it is greater for the greatest island, for the most perfect island, to exist in reality than for it to not exist in reality, right? Therefore, the island must exist. But just thinking that doesn't magically make an island appear in the middle of the ocean. Such is the same logic in Anselm's idea, ontological argument for God. So again, we're already seeing kind of flaws in this claim for absolute knowledge. We keep kind of trying to get to it, and then somebody's like, well, hang on, that doesn't really make sense. So this was all going on in Europe at the time during the medieval period. At the same time, in the Middle East, you had the Islamic Golden Age. This was a period that lasted from about 800 to 1200 AD. Forgot to put the AD on there. It's not BC. Essentially, the Islamic Golden Age is incredibly important because among inventing many things like translation, coffee, universities, we wouldn't be here without the Islamic Golden Age. Numbers, the Islamic Golden Age did many things for us. And one of the main things was maintaining some of the key philosophical debates that were kind of dying out in Europe. So obviously, we did have Anselm and Galileo and Aquinas and Augustine, who we didn't really talk about, who were kind of keeping these thoughts alive. But there was a more historical thing going on where a lot of these ancient records were getting lost. The Islamic Golden Age preserved them and continued to engage with them, and in fact was the reason we later got them back in history and we started kind of consulting them more. Um, some key thinkers in the Islamic Golden Age were Al-Farabi and Avicenna, who were essentially sorry, I'm getting ahead. Al-Farabi and Avicenna, they were essentially reteaching Plato and Aristotle, respectively, in the Islamic context. Al-Farabi was more what we call Neoplatonic, i.e., new Plato thinker, and Avicenna was more Aristotelian, or teaching Aristotle. But who I really want to talk about is a very interesting figure called Al-Ghazali. So Al-Ghazali read a bunch of Avicenna, read a bunch of Al-Farabi, and he too, like all philosophers, wanted to do the same thing, try to get to true indisputable knowledge. He thought that maybe it was what we see, observation, right? But then he thought, well, no, what if our whole life is just a dream, right? How do I know that I'm awake? Because when I'm dreaming, I don't know if I'm awake. I don't know that I'm dreaming. So what if the whole life is dreaming? It's a bit like the whole simulation thought before simulations were an idea. He also then tried to think, well, what about reason? But reason also kind of has its flaws, as we've seen in A Priori, Galileo slamming Anselm and Diogenes slamming Plato. It doesn't quite work. And he got into this little rut of what we call skepticism, that guy we were talking about with Socrates way back. Except for Al-Ghazali, it was not fun. He went sick for 10 years and he couldn't think at all until eventually he came out. And the conclusion he came to was something that actually didn't really get touched on properly for a very long time, but was a very important thought. He believed that some truths cannot be deduced by reason or observation alone, and therefore there must be a new source of knowledge, that being divine faith. Now, obviously, for Al-Ghazali, this was the Islamic God, but this idea of a divine faith is actually something that we'll see applied in later philosophers to something more general and something that we can more generally apply to our thought, that sometimes we don't need to have absolute reasonable truth or empirical truth, that is truth that we see or can measure. Sometimes we just need to go by faith. So we've kind of done a bit of a roundup of the medieval period there. We've looked at what was going on in Europe. We've looked at what's going on in the Islamic Golden Age. Now we come to what was called the Enlightenment. And maybe you've not heard of this guy, but I feel like you might have heard of what he said. And this is Descartes. So Descartes was what we call a rationalist. Now, again, we're going to come across some of the same kind of dichotomies as the Islamic Golden Age, and especially Plato and Aristotle, between that which we can think about and that which we see. Descartes was very much all about that which we think. He did a bit of the same thing as Al-Ghazali, where he tried to find absolute truth by letting go of everything that he thought he knew. This kind of what we call Cartesian doubt. He looked at everything and was like, I don't know anything. I don't know if I'm real. I could be in a dream. I don't know if this is in front of me, because I don't know if my physical senses are something that I can trust, right? But the one thing that he was sure of, was the fact that he was thinking, right? The fact that he was able to have these questions at all showed that something was going on. Therefore, he thought, therefore he was. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am, is the very famous quote that hopefully you might have heard of. And from here, he was able to establish this new line of thought, of rationalist thought. He believed that essentially knowledge could be found within, very similar to Plato. But it all came from kind of stripping away of everything that we thought we knew. Against him, we had people like Francis Bacon and the empiricists. So I mentioned earlier, the word empiricist means something that we can measure, right? And Francis Bacon was a scientist, very similar to Aristotle. And he's most famous for essentially inventing what we now know as the scientific method, which is where we make an observation, we make some kind of conclusion, a hypothesis, we test it, we make a new observation, we make a conclusion, and we continue until we come to some new kind of knowledge. Francis Bacon essentially was one of the main people who really invented that, but he was also generally a philosopher. He never really knew Descartes personally, but his thought was very much in opposition to Descartes' idea, which was that knowledge was ingrained. Descartes believed that once we pop into existence, like Plato's forms, things and knowledge are things that we can eventually find. They're within us, we just have to find them. Francis Bacon didn't at all think this. He thought that it was all external and we had to go out and discover it. In this sense, he established his own school of thought, that being the empiricists, all about the observation of the natural world. And you had particularly Hume, David Hume, who was an empiricist, a Scottish philosopher in the 18th century. He was in complete disagreement with René Descartes, but he was a bit of an extremist about it. See, there's one key thing that we kind of all agree about the way the world works, which is that one thing leads to another, right? This is also called teleological thinking. So that's because we have that logical bit, the study of, the understanding of. Telos, that suffix, means ending or goal. This teleological idea is that one thing leads to another to an eventual end, right? Hume didn't believe in that. Hume believed that everything was happening kind of at the same time. And it's a very weird kind of thought, but there's a kind of way that he expressed it that is incredibly important for some of the ways that we apply epistemology and we think about knowledge, because he made a distinction between ises and oughts. And this is one that I really hope that you go away with and remember, is that some things are, something maybe is a certain way. That doesn't mean that it ought to be a certain way. For his logic, he thought that just because, and this is a very famous example, he thought about billiard balls or pool cue balls, that you could see one ball going towards the other, and just because it is going towards the other doesn't mean it ought to make the other ball move. He thinks it's equally likely that the ball go completely to the left or the ball completely sink into the ground. He sounds a bit kooky, but the general idea of what he's saying is very important because, again, think back to some ethical applications of epistemology, like Aristotle, who took his observations, his a posteriori observations of the world around him, and he believed that just because that was a certain way, that it ought to be a certain way. And if, for example, he had taken on Hume's thoughts of ises and oughts, there's a question of whether it would have. There's a question of whether it would have gone that bad. It's a very important kind of thought to hold on to. Later in the same century, we have Immanuel Kant. So Immanuel Kant was a very interesting figure. He was a German philosopher, a bit later in the century than Hume. And essentially, he tried to combine the two sides. He thought that, okay, yes, we can only know things as we see them, but the way that we see them is kind of the way that we think. So he thought that the way we think is inherently kind of limited, that we are always disconnected from the truth of the way things are. He believed that there is a difference between the objective reality of maybe, say, nature or how plants work, and there is a difference between what we see. I think the best example of this really is that maybe you've heard this fact: shrimps see more colors than us. And that's because they just have an access to a wider range of the light spectrum. Our eyes don't work that way. We literally are limited by the way our bodies work to how we see. Think also about cold-blooded animals that see ultraviolet, right? And sense these extra waves that we have no way of really sensing. Kant was the first to kind of make this link that there's kind of a bit of both. That yes, the things that we know are tied to um, our tools of knowledge, our tools of observation, but those are inherently flawed by our reason. Um, and again, this kind of thought puts us in a bad space because, again, how do we know what to think? And this is where our next guy, Kierkegaard, makes a big leap of faith. That was kind of on purpose. So Søren Kierkegaard was a Danish philosopher in the 19th century. He's quite famous for establishing what we now call existentialism, which is an ethical application of some of the epistemological things that he thought about. So Kierkegaard was very much in a similar camp to Kant, where he believed that our personal subjective experiences took precedence over any objective reality of the world. There's a quote, I'm not sure if it's necessarily him, but it's sometimes tied to a good summary of his belief, which is that subjectivity is truth, which is almost an absurd sentence, right? Because when I'm trying to make an argument, I want to be objective, right? But for Kierkegaard, he thought that at the end of the day, much like Kant, our senses are inherently limited. We can never claim to have objective knowledge, so we can only go by our subjective sense. So for anyone to really know anything, he argued that we need to take a qualitative leap, or sometimes also called a leap of faith, because we can get lost in the infinite and the finite, the infinite choices of everything that the world kind of has to offer and everything that the world might know. Also, the infinite of the capacity of knowledge that we are incapable of knowing. But we can also get lost in the finite of everything that we should know, everything that is observable, and not knowing it. Kierkegaard argues that to get over either of these, you need to make this qualitative leap or a leap of faith, which I'm hoping rings a few bells back to Al-Ghazali, because this is essentially very much a repeated argument that an extra form of knowledge, we have our innate reason, we have observations of the outside world, and we have just faith. Now, I want to kind of eventually take stock here of the different thoughts. I've kind of done it there, but before I do that, I actually want to bring up another very important figure, because he's going to come into the last person that I want to talk about, and this is Wittgenstein. So Wittgenstein was a German philosopher, an Austrian philosopher, sorry, from the last century, the early 20th century. But he was also a philosopher of language. He was especially kind of interested in the way that we tie knowledge to language. We kind of assume that because a triangle is defined as a triangle, that it must have three sides. And we kind of always held that. I mean, we've continuously seen people try and carry that on in some way by making some kind of indisputable definition of something. Plato with defining a man, Anselm with defining God. And Wittgenstein comes in here and he says, there's no point. He argued a word hasn't got a meaning given to it, as it were, by a power independent of us, so that there could be a kind of scientific investigation into what the word really means. A word has the meaning someone has given to it. So this kind of blows everything out of the water, because again, we're in this position where we were at the start of this whole PowerPoint, right, with Socrates, where we had no idea what to think. So let's take stock. Let's look. What are our options? We could go into complete skepticism. We could be like Diogenes, live on the street and yell at people, ask people questions like Socrates until they get mad at us and want to kill us, or be Wittgenstein and just think that language inherently cannot have an objective meaning. We could, of course, try and trust our intuitive reason, like Plato and the rationalists like Descartes. Um, if you're not so sure about the capacity of your brain, maybe you think that the whole world is a dream and you cannot believe everything that you think. Well, maybe you believe in empirical evidence. Maybe you think that only what I can see, only what I can hear, what I can test, what I can truly kind of experience, that is true knowledge. Maybe you think that God can only be true if I see him, if I see some kind of proof, right? And then, of course, there is the reality that Algeciras and Kierkegaard come to, which is just faith, because all of these things fail us. Empirical evidence fails us because maybe we're dreaming. Intuitive reason fails us because maybe our brains cannot understand what's going on. And complete skepticism gets us nowhere. It gets us killed, frankly. So sometimes you just need to make some kind of leap of faith or a divine faith in God. So these are the kind of options that we're left with. And I want to kind of pivot into a modern day application of what we do now, because we've thought a lot about all these different forms of knowledge. And now, at the end of the day, this presentation is going to end and you're going to have to re-enter society and live in the world. And what do you do when you have all these famous old people that have been dead for hundreds of years telling you that you can never know anything? And then other people saying, well, actually, you can know one thing, and then 10 people saying that you can't. And Timothy Morton is a good example of trying to use some of the things that we've talked about to make some kind of important change in the world. So Timothy Morton is a British philosopher currently living in Texas, working at Rice University. They're also a literary critic, which of course is why I'm so interested in them. They wrote a book called Ecology Without Nature in 2007, all about criticizing this use of the word nature that we've gotten way too attached to. Very much kind of taking the idea that Wittgenstein had, that language only has meaning that we give it, and therefore we can question it. And questioning doesn't just mean that we don't know anything, it means that we can reevaluate it in something that better suits us, that better helps us. For Morton, this is all about realizing that nature, when we use the word nature in things like nature writing or nature poetry, or getting in touch with nature, this kind of turns the word nature into a buzzword that actually loses its effectiveness. We don't really think about nature as it really is. We don't think about we think about trees and flowers and grass. We don't think about earth and worms and soil. We don't think about the bugs that have to live there, that contribute to the health of the grass. We don't think about the damage that we're doing to the earth. We just think that, well, if I recycle, that's good for nature, right? Timothy Morton wants to destabilize this use of the word nature. They argue that the word has become meaningless and even directly adversarial to the health of the environment. So by kind of critiquing this, Timothy Morton puts this new thought of dark ecology, which is this kind of idea that I've talked about, of reframing our use of the word nature to the non-human. Timothy Morton very much likes the phrase the non-human, the um, or the natural world. Even that is somewhat flawed. Ecology, especially dark ecology. The point of dark ecology is all about acknowledging these extra aspects of nature that we kind of have to live with, like things like mold and weeds and rot. These are all actually necessary parts of the ecosystem that we need to kind of embrace as a part of the cycle. This is a very important kind of reapplication of the epistemological thinking that we've been talking about in this presentation. It's taking a healthy amount of skepticism against language like Wittgenstein and against this idea of objective truth and trying to take us somewhere important, somewhere that will help us as a species. So I think that just about finishes us off. I hope that you've enjoyed it. I hope that I've given you a decent kind of overview of the main thinkers throughout philosophical thinkers throughout time. I hope I've interested you to go and do your own research. Very interested to hear any questions you have. I do want to remind you I am only an English student, so there's only so much that I can help with, but I can